Well, thanks for joining me here for another one of our student interviews for the OCBS. That's my cat. And why don't we start off by you just introducing yourself, telling our audience, our viewers, who you are, and shortly what they can expect to hear from us in this interview. So what you do, etc. And then we'll get right into the actual interview.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, Alex. It's my pleasure to be talking to you and your cat, I suppose.
Yes.
I am a doctoral candidate in the Department of Religious Studies at University of Virginia. I'm currently in my dissertation writing stage and hopefully will finish and defend my dissertation soon. So my area of expertise is Tibetan Buddhism with also interest in Indian esoteric Buddhism and Chinese Buddhism as well. So, okay. And I assume we're talking here today probably more about how did I start my PhD and what am I working on and possibly what I plan to do in the future. So yeah, I look forward to that.
Yes, yes, that's true. That's obviously what we are sort of interested in these kind of interviews that we're doing here is to get to know sort of those actual students who are sort of in Buddhist studies and who are currently becoming researchers, are already researchers, and sort of what are the topics that people are working on, etc. That a wider sort of audience and also non-academics can get a glimpse into, okay, what does academic Buddhist studies look like today? So, yes, you already mentioned shortly what your thesis is about. I guess we can sort of dive in more deeply into that. So, what are you working on right now at your, or what have you been working on when you're, and also why? So why did you choose to work on that and not on one of the many other topics, etc.?
Sure. So I'm currently, like I said, I'm currently writing my dissertation. It is titled Conceiving the Mother of Tibet, the Life, Lives, and Afterlife of the Buddhist Saint Yeshe Tsogyel. So Yeshe Tsogyel is one of the most well-known, probably the foremost matron saint or female saint in Tibetan Buddhism. And she's said to be the consort of the 8th century Tibetan tantric, not really Tibetan, but Indian tantric master Padmasambhava. And so she's his main disciple and his consort, and is the one responsible to carry on his teaching lineage to future generations. So what I am interested in the dissertation is to look at source materials about her in the 14th and 15th century and how the tradition she is situated in, the Cheshire or in Tibetan Dharma tradition, thinks of herself. So it has a dual focus of looking at the tradition itself, how it conceived of its past in the 8th century and connects that to the future, but also with a more particular interest in women's religiosity or women's role in these religious communities at this time. And as to how I come into this dissertation topic, when I came into my doctoral program in 2013 at Virginia, I have no idea what I want to work on at that time. I know I want to do something about Tibetan literature, probably something about Tibetan Buddhist histories, and I know I'm interested in women's participation in religion at that point. And I think in 2013, there's this wonderful publisher at Larungar Buddhist Academy in Kham in China, and they published a 16-volume collection of women's lives, eminent women's lives in Tibet. And I came across that collection, I think in 2014 when I made my first trip to Larungar, and there are two new, to that point, unstudied and only recently been rediscovered earlier life stories of Yeshe Tsogyel. So I started reading them with different professors here also at Harvard University. And So that became one of my central interests in my study. So I decided to write my dissertation on this female figure.
Okay, yes. So you're saying that when you started your PhD, you didn't know what to work on. So why did you start the PhD then? So you only knew I want to work on something. I don't know what it is yet. Or did you know, okay, I'm sort of I really like teaching, or did you have some experience with it? Sorry, or anything
No
like
worries.
that. So, what was the drive for you to sort of start a PhD if you didn't know exactly what to actually do when you're in the program?
Yeah, I think I'm probably not the best example of a most motivated PhD student in Buddhist studies.
Well, Buddhist.
That's good to know. I came in. I think I started being interested in Tibetan Buddhism and Indian Buddhism when I started learning Sanskrit and Tibetan in 2009, when I was still just beginning my master's at Renmin University of China in Beijing. So my undergrad has nothing to do with Buddhism or Tibetan or Sanskrit. I did my undergrad on classical Chinese literature. And I started learning those two languages, and that's what I think got me first interested in the field. So I decided to pursue this interest further, and I started doing a master's at the Divinity School at University of Chicago. I think that those 2 years is the first time I was exposed to the field of religious studies in the state that it is, in the US and probably in Europe as well. And that become, I think, something fascinating to me, as I had very little prior exposure to religious studies and also to Buddhist studies as well. So I think that is the reason why I wanted to go into a PhD program, is to continue learning Tibetan and Sanskrit, but also to get to know more about the discipline of religious studies.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. And why then this particular program and this university? Did you have a choice, or did you from the beginning you knew, okay, it has to be that one? And or was it the professor that you're working with now who sort of motivated you to apply there, or how exactly did you end up at this program and this university?
So yeah, it's a very good question. Again, I think I'm a bad example. I would not advise this to any other students who wanted to get into PhD. I think I only applied to 3 schools. I was at the University of Chicago at the time. I applied to Chicago, of course. I applied to Harvard University to work with Professor Leonard van der Kijp, who I have studied with previously in China, and also to UVA. I think at that time, I know I want to work on religious studies, and I know I want someone who work on Tibetan Buddhism. So, and there are other schools with very strong Tibetan program, like Columbia University and Berkeley, probably at that time. But I guess I was lazy, so I really only applied to 3 schools, and I did not get into Chicago or Harvard. And I think the UVA notification came really late, so I was not sure if I actually wanted to continue doing the PhD. I was ready to pack and go home and do something else. And then I had an interview with Professor David Germano and Professor Curtis Schaefer here. And I talked with them on the phone, and I decided to come to Charlottesville and do a campus visit. I think that I made up my mind after the visit, after seeing everyone at the program, and after meeting the professors in person, that I decided to do the PhD here. I think it's a very good community. I think people are very supportive of each other. It can be a harrowing experience doing a PhD, so I think the community matters. And the 2 professors here also share my interest in first religion, Buddhism, but also literature and history. So I think it was my only choice, but it is a very good fit, and I had a wonderful 7-year experience here, so no complaints.
I see. Wow. Okay. Yeah. So it did sort of deliver what you expected from it, or were there any sort of surprises or anything that you didn't know about a PhD program until you entered it, and then you sort of suddenly realized, oh God, I have to teach maybe sort of as an assistant from a professor and you didn't know before, or was there anything that sort of did anything go according to plan, or what was your plan, and any surprises, or what does the reality of a PhD program look like?
Yeah, again, I think one thing I probably did not prepare myself for is the workload of the PhD program.
Yeah.
And we have changed the system now, but I think we had to start teaching our first year. Teaching, by teaching I mean serving as teaching assistant at the University of Virginia. So you were basically thrown into the whirlwind of teaching, plus taking language courses, plus taking seminars, plus adjusting to an entirely new environment and an entirely new career at that time. So for me, the first year is a little bit tough. It took a lot of adjustment. I was taking 7 classes my first semester and 5 plus teaching my second. So it was very hectic. But then I think after the second year, once you get a little bit more of the rhythm and the hand of the situation, it became a little bit better. But I'll be honest, it is a lot of work and it takes a very long time. So I think, it needs a lot of determination and commitment for anyone who wants to do a PhD, I think.
Yeah. And sort of you were carried through by your interest in the field, right? So all those hindrances, the first year were difficult, etc., but still you managed to pull through because you really wanted to study the subject and really were sort of into it, or why would you say that you sort of what make you overcome those kind of obstacles, and what helped you in the first year?
I think there's probably 2 things, and one thing is I'm continuing learning about a topic I'm super interested in, which is religion and how to study religion. And that is something I'm just very, very keen to learn, that I'm new to, and I'm still extremely excited about. And the other thing is I had 0 teaching experience prior to coming to UVA, and I had no idea if I will like teaching or not. But once I started teaching from the first semester onwards, and I was lucky enough to get a lot of mentorship from the professors that I've TA'd with. So it is an extremely positive experience. It is something I did not know that I loved, but I become really obsessed and passionate about teaching, I think, my first semester onwards. So that is also something that I think has kept me going in the program.
Wow, that's great. So already now you're sort of looking at if you want to become a professor, or maybe sort of do you see yourself sort of remaining at university or and teaching and researching, or what are your plans in that regard?
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard horror stories of the academic job market, and so I will, at this point now, be grateful to continue to be doing whatever I'm doing right now. So I would love to have a teaching job. I like talking to the students. I find that not only empowering them, but also helping me with my own research by teaching about it. So I like to have a teaching component in my future job, and I also would love continuing doing research. And I started doing a little bit more public reach or community project with Tibetan communities in China in the past year or so. That is also a component I like to continue doing in my future professional development.
So that is not part of your actual PhD thesis, but you just started doing it sort of on your own in your in the little spare time that you have, or?
Right, and I think that is actually part of the UVA brand. Is professors here, Professor Romano and Professor Schaefer, are passionate about giving back to the Tibetan community, who has been so generous in letting us and helping us study their culture and their history in the past decades. So a lot of UVA students go to China. They help in whatever way they can. They help with programs here. And one thing I am doing in the spring, actually in April, is I'm organizing a workshop titled Writing Tibetan Women. So we're inviting groups of Tibetan female writers from China, from India, and for those living in the US to come together to present their writings and to have scholars, mostly living in the US, but we also have actually Dr. Lamajap from Oxford University to come to the workshop and to discuss their work and to talk about women's role in contemporary Tibetan literature.
Yeah.
So this is something I obviously have very little to do with my dissertation, but it's something that of a side interest of mine, and I'm just excited to be helping to make this happen.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, yeah, that sounds very interesting, that workshop. Yeah. So is that your focus on sort of women and the role of women and that literature that you're studying, etc.? So is that from a sort of gender studies perspective, feminist perspective, or how would you characterize your angle when it comes to these kind of issues?
Sure, that's a great question, and I think absolutely it is. It uses gender as a lens to look at the materials because it is writings about a Buddhist woman we're looking at. So her gender absolutely, and I argue that her gender plays a crucial role in her apotheosis, that she becomes the mother of Tibet and become the matron saint of Tibet.
Yeah.
But I would hesitate to say that it's a feminist project because in the dissertation itself, and because this is, I don't think the word or the term feminism applies in the writings that I'm reading.
Okay.
And if I try to read feminist thoughts into the works, the sources that I'm engaging with, I think that is something I'm extremely cautious about, is to try to represent the sources in their own languages and try to make sense of it in its own terms, and try not to make something feminist or not feminist. But I do think gender as a concept, we definitely see gender differentiation in Tibet and in Tibetan Buddhism. That could be a extremely useful perspective in historical and religious analysis, for sure.
That's very interesting. And so from the content of your actual thesis, right? So not the surroundings in terms of, okay, this is you trying to manage the first year and that workload, etc. But from the content and the reading the literature, etc. Were there any problems that you encountered, and sort of any, if it's terms that you didn't manage to translate for weeks or months, or the concepts that you encountered that you didn't really know about and that your professors didn't know about, or what were the kind of problems that you encountered sort of from the content perspective of your actual thesis?
Right. That's a good question. There were many problems.
Yeah.
I'll just be honest. And so the materials that I'm looking at belongs to this particular tradition in the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism that is called Terma, or treasure. And its language, I've been working on this for the past 4 or 5 years, and I can say I understand the grammar, the syntax, and the way of writing pretty well. But there are absolutely times, and there are many occasions during which you just have absolutely no idea what the text is saying. It's either a word that could be archaic or very local or dialect term that you have never encountered before, and it's not in Tibetan dictionaries, for example. It could be that you knowing all the words, but you have no idea what that short sentence is saying. So that definitely present itself, like the irregularities in spelling and in writing definitely present itself as a problem. So one thing I did with it is I travel back to Asia every summer, if not more, say in the winter, and we do have a 1-year fieldwork requirement in our department. So everyone has to go to Asia, say India, Nepal, or China, to do their field research. So one thing I do is I carry my text with you. I have a list of questions or terms that I don't quite understand. I just ask people on the ground. I ask Kimball's, I ask Nang's, I ask basically local people at different areas of Tibet, because there are different dialects in the Tibetan language, and they can vary drastically across space and time. So that sometimes that will help solving the problem. Sometimes people say, "Oh yeah, that word just means this," and it was a revelation to me. And it turns out it comes from a local dialect in southern central Tibet. Okay. Sometimes people will all scratch their head and say, "Yeah, we really don't know." So you have to live with the part, the understanding, I guess, that there are just parts of the Tibetan language that we're still working on towards. We still don't quite know all the pieces of the puzzle, but you have to live with that tiny bit of uncertainty at times, for sure.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Well, so that is a research trip that is fully funded by your university, or? Because obviously you're sort of traveling for 1 year to Asia and staying there, etc. All that will incur costs, right? That you don't have to bear, or that you're partly the university, partly yourself, or how does that work at your department?
So I think for everyone it's a little bit differently. And for me, that year of my field research, I was funded by the funding package at UVA, but we also have colleagues applying for external funding.
Okay.
Say there's dissertation, travel, fellowships, and they will receive external fellowship to do their field research. So that's also possible.
Yeah. Okay. Wow, that's interesting. How was that for you, the field research?
It was a lot of fun for me, and I was in Nepal for I think for about 2 months. So one time in September and the other time in February. So I get to visit a lot of the sacred sites in Nepal that is associated with Yeshe Tsogyel, the woman I'm working on. So I went to Lower Mustang. I did a 8-day trekking. So it's a fascinating experience, and you get to see a lot of meditation caves that she is said to have meditated in.
Wow.
So I think being in the place has the effect of your understanding of the religious tradition and your understanding of the text. And the other times I was based in Chengdu, but I took many side research trips into Tibetan areas of China. So, and also visiting sites, but also going to archives and talking to professors, monks or nuns, so things like that.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, of course, seeing sort of, as you're saying, meditation caves that may have been sort of used by the person you're studying is, of course, it allows you to connect with that person in a totally different way than just sort of reading the text, etc., and only having sort of ideas. But being in the same place, I guess that sort of allows you to really get close to the person you're looking at, right? And at least feel closer to them.
Right, exactly. And the text will say it is a cave with a certain shape, but you can only use your very limited imagination until you actually get to the cave and look at what the rock the text was talking about. So that was a fascinating experience.
Wow, okay. Yeah, that's great. You see, because that is great about religious studies, that there is a sort of heavy focus on field research and sort of also the still modern living traditions, and not merely textual studies and not merely reading the text, etc., but really to also get into the field, get to know sort of the Buddhism that still is there, and also the places that are still sort of important for it, etc., and not be sort of restricted to only reading a text and only being sort of with those translations and your own text and the source text, etc., but really to get into the field, as you're saying. I think that's to me, that was a big plus also for myself, why I, from Buddhist studies, I shifted a bit into religious studies to get this entire methodology and this entire fieldwork part of it as well, and not be only sort of translating and only reading text.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think even for textualists, it is crucial to understand the surrounding context of the material you're reading, and that includes going to the places, it includes talking to people, and people who are who may live in the area that you're reading about, or
Yeah.
people who are actually still reading the same text that you're reading, and they have sometimes a transmission for that text that you understanding that might otherwise be unavailable if you're
Yeah.
just doing the reading practice.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I don't know if you know about Hermann Oldenberg, who was one of the sort of pioneers of Buddhist studies, especially Theravada studies. And
Mm-hmm.
he was the guy who made the first edition of the Vinaya, the Pali Vinaya, from the Pali Text Society, published by them. And when he first went to Sri Lanka, he actually was quite shocked to see that he knew the Vinaya better than many of the monks he encountered. And he sort of saw them doing stuff that they were actually prohibited from according to the Vinaya, and sort of they were breaking rules that he knew about that they didn't seem to know about or care about, etc. So he was quite shocked how different the lived reality of that religion today is
Mm-hmm.
compared to him having this sort of only imaginary view of it based on the text and the sort of maybe even idealized form of Theravada as he sort of imagined it to be, and then sort of encountering the living tradition and being shocked by it.
Right.
Did you have
Yeah.
any sort of similar experience? Did you see any kind of gap between the stuff that you knew from reading about it and from looking at the text, and then now seeing the places, seeing the people, seeing people living that religion? Or also, not just gaps, but maybe also you saw, okay, this is what I read about, and this is how I thought it would be, and I saw it actually is this way. Right? So people are actually doing this. As you're saying, people are still reading the text, etc. Did you have any kind of those experiences?
Yeah, let's see. So actually, because I work on Tibetan Buddhist women,
Yeah.
and I get my text from Lauren Gar's
Mm-hmm.
Income Tibet, and I end up going back there almost probably every year
Mm-hmm.
at this point, and I have established friendships with a lot of the nuns there. And one of my future projects that I have started doing the past 2
Mm-hmm.
years will probably be about Tibetan Buddhist nuns at Larangar,
Oh,
actually.
okay.
So I talk to them and about how they read text, and
Mm-hmm.
especially because they are the editor
Yeah.
of these collections, so how they collect text, how they think about female nantars or female life stories, and how they actually get inspirations from
Mm-hmm.
them.
Yeah.
And one of the things that when you teach women's lives in Tibetan Buddhism, example will be you see almost in every life story of Tibetan Buddhist women, you see them denigrating themselves as having a inferior body, or
Mm.
lumen in Tibetan. They will say, as a woman, I was burdened with extra bad karma and extra illnesses in this body. I was born inferior. And when you are teaching, say, American students, this
Mm-hmm.
is something that they always struggle with, is the idea that being born as a woman in Buddhism means that you have extra bad karma in your previous lives.
Yeah.
And this is something they're always hard to come to terms with, to grapple with.
Mm.
And they always struggle with saying, does this mean Buddhism is sexist? Does it mean
Mm.
Buddhism is misogynistic? And
Yeah.
they really don't like, my students really don't like that aspect.
Yeah.
So one time I decided to bring that question to the nuns I've been talking to.
Mm-hmm.
So I asked them, so what's the deal with this inferior body? Like, how do you reconcile that with your everyday lived reality? And for them, they admit that yes, we agree. As women were born with inferior bodies,
Mm.
but also this means you get to overcome a bigger hurdle of adversities in your practice, and that I think generates more good karma for them, and I think
Mm.
generates a better practice.
Yeah.
So that's one of the answers that I got, and the other is to advise me to actually look past this
Mm.
previous life and to look at the more important goals for practicing Buddhism. It's not about being born in a male or female body,
Mm.
and you should not have gender discriminating thoughts, but rather to achieve enlightenment. And as long as being born as a woman is possible for you to get enlightened,
Mm.
you should not be taken aback by having an inferior body.
Mm.
And this might still be something that's hard to explain to the students and have them totally agree with this nonce. But also you see the complexity surrounding that idea and the ways people deal with, say, a standard notion of women having inferior body. And I would not say all of those attitudes are sexist. If you just read the text, you say, yeah, inferior female body, that's sexist. And the reality is much, much more complex than that. It could be empowering. It could be something that is to be transcended. It could be also sexist at times and kind of blocking you from a spiritual success. But it's a lot more complex than something that is just misogynistic or simply women having an inferior body. And there's no way to interpret around it. So I think that would be one example of you see the lived aspect of a religion.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So if we take a step back from now sort of being in the nitty-gritty of your thesis, and if you look at the context of sort of Buddhist studies, where do you religious studies, where do you see sort of your work, what you're doing right now in your thesis, where does that fit in? So where is it a sort of subtopic within Buddhist studies or religious studies, and how does it relate to sort of other fields? So for example, if you go to a conference, what would be the workshops that you would look at and the things that you would listen to that you think are sort of relevant for you? And who would you expect, for example, to listen to your stuff? So who do you expect to be interested in what you are doing? And do you think that sort of other subfields within Buddhist studies can gain something from it, etc.? So could you locate what you're doing within the discipline of Buddhist studies a bit?
Sure. I think what my work is trying to answer on the broadest scale is how local or localized forms of Buddhism take shape in Tibet in the 14th and 15th century. And I think that is something that is more prevalent. That is something you see everywhere in every Buddhist traditions. It is that it emanates in vastly different local forms in all the contexts that it encountered. You have Indian Buddhism in prior to the Common Era. You have Sri Lankan Buddhism, you have Thai Buddhism, and then later in the Mahayana tradition, you have Buddhism coming through the Silk Roads to Tibet and to China, later to Japan, to Korea. And in each of the places, it encounters a different culture, and it gained tremendous degree of success by what I think is adaptation to the local culture and taking on a new, renewed form of Buddhism. So you end up with vastly different Buddhist traditions virtually all over the world. And if we're talking about today, there's also American Buddhism or European Buddhism that is, again, slightly different than the tradition where it came from. So I think that's one of the fascinating aspects about Buddhism and about Buddhist study. And I think my dissertation answers that in the Tibetan medieval context. And the treasure tradition is interesting because it is a tradition that kind of prefers or prioritizes scripture revelation across ordinary temporal and spatial constraint to the actual lineage transmission you have carried down history. So its authority comes back from imperial Tibet in the 8th century. And the way it does it is through visions and through revelation of sacred objects that was either buried in actual geographical sites or buried in people's mind. So it lays a fascinating claim as to what counts as real Buddhism and what people think is real, authentic Buddhism at that time in that place. So I think that's one of the bigger questions. And for for people in religious studies, I think anyone interested in gender and religion, or in women and religion, or in how religious communities think about history and time and literature and literature genres will be interesting in my work, because it also touches on certain topics as well. So
so you just also talked about how sort of people who work on modern or Western or American, etc., Buddhism can sort of gain from looking at your thesis. And what would you say, is there anything that, not academics, but actual sort of right now practicing Buddhists can learn from it? So whether it's a Tibetan Buddhist or a nun or a monk or whoever it is, so what could Buddhists who live nowadays in the modern era, what can they learn from you talking about a medieval, as you're saying, Tibetan text and sort of studying it, etc.? Is there something that a modern day Buddhist nun can learn from it, or a modern day Buddhist monk, or not just monastics, also normal practitioners, so everyday people, the laity who is still sort of interested in Buddhism, following Buddhism in whichever form? So what could they sort of gain from your thesis?
Sure. I actually, like I said, I work with nuns a lot for my dissertation and for this other project, and they will obviously ask me what I'm doing, and I try to explain what is philological studies and what I do with texts and different versions. And sometimes you would think they would be opposed to the idea that I'm trying to hunt down something that could be claimed as historical truth about these Buddhist women, but they find it fascinating to have more materials and more work done on Buddhist women, and to know more about what scholars are thinking about what is the role of the feminine in Buddhism. And I think that is something the contemporary Tibetan Buddhist communities and work with are extremely interested in. So hopefully they will like what I write about that. Hopefully that'll help them in their practice as well.
Yeah.
And nuns I talk to, they also read the life stories of Yeshe Tsogyel that I was talking about. And for them, they are sources of empowerment and sources of inspiration. And the other part of Buddhism's different emanations, that also there's a surprising degree of continuity, not just through space, but also through time. So you see a lot of the shared sentiments in, say, a 14th century writing about 8th century Buddhist women being resonated in the 21st century Tibetan Buddhist nuns' life. So I think that is something they also see in the research that I'm doing.
I see. Yeah. Well, great. Well, that's already it for our interview. I would just like to add, so if people are sort of interested and more in what you're doing, where can they sort of find you? I've seen that you have a website, right? So on the Department of Religious Studies website for your university, you have a profile there,
yes.
and people can sort of look at it, and you will update it regularly, I guess, when you publish anything new or something like that. But how else could people follow you?
Yeah, so there, yes, we're looking at my profile on the Religious Studies website, and there is my email address. So for people who wants to get in touch, I also have a academia.edu profile.
I see.
That I unfortunately was not upgrade very regularly, but it does have my contact information, has my probably one of the older versions of my CV.
Yeah.
And I think after I graduate, I'll try to do a better job of keeping that page up to date.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
So much
For the interview and for your time. And I look forward to seeing you publish your thesis and the rest of your career.
Thank you very much. I look forward to that too. And best of luck with your work. This is a fascinating initiative. I I think someone should done this much sooner than now, but this is great work.
Right. Thanks. Thanks.